reform. Joining us now is House Minority Whip Steny Hoyer. It is good to have you on the show, sir.
Good morning, Chris. Glad to be with you.
Sessions says, legal counsel told me I did not have to disclose these meetings with the Russian ambassador. They were coincidental. They weren't fundamental. I meet with thousands of people in my capacity as a senator. This was okay.
Well, if he had it in his mind as to whether or not he ought to disclose it, certainly he ought to disclose it in his testimony before the Senate committee. There was nobody advising him then. The question that was asked, did you have any contacts with Russian officials? He should have said, yes, I did, and they were incidental. He could have said that. But what really is so concerning is the pattern that exists here. First of all, you start out with Manafort and Stone and Flynn, Page and others who had very close financial relationships with the Russians. Then you have a candidate who talks very positively about Putin, who is, I think, by most of the world seen as an international lawbreaker and a underminer of human rights and murders both journalists and opponents in his country. You have a candidate who is justifying feeling that he's a pretty good guy. And then you have this continuing pattern of cover-up. So that it's the pattern, Chris, that I think leads one to believe that there's fire where there's so much smoke. And the investigations that are underway, not only by Bob Mueller, who I think was a good appointment, and I think we have faith and trust in him, but in the investigations of the intelligence committees and both the House and the Senate. And in my view, we ought to appoint a special commission, similar to the 9/11 Commission, to look at the broader impact of Russian involvement in our elections, not necessarily from a criminal standpoint, but from a undermining of our democracy standpoint. So I think all of these continuing small but meaningful patterns of cover-up and dissembling raise a great deal of concern for the American people, and we need to have a thorough investigation and get to the bottom of it.
Two questions. First, smoke maybe, but not a smoking gun. And
right.
What does it mean that you haven't had any hard proof of actual collusion to this point?
Well, what it means is, obviously, that we don't yet have hard evidence. But you recall in Watergate, frankly, there were a couple of years of smoke with no smoking gun. And then ultimately a smoking gun was made available through testimony, John Dean and others. And I think that the same thing may well happen here. It may not. And if it doesn't, frankly, the American people will have greater confidence in the President's relationship with Russia and others. But if it does, then I think you're going to see substantial adverse action with respect to the Trump administration.
The Flynn subpoenas, he has a right to assert his Fifth Amendment right against self-protection. You can't throw him in contempt once he does that. What is the goal with these secondary subpoenas now with Flynn?
Well, they're looking for documents, I suppose, which are certainly discoverable items, and they're looking to have him come before the committee. And you're absolutely right. Of course, he has a right to claim his rights under the Fifth Amendment to not incriminate himself. But the irony is, of course, Flynn himself repeatedly asserted that if somebody took the Fifth Amendment, well, they must be guilty. So that Flynn is in a somewhat contradictory position himself. But you're right, Chris. Of course he has the right to claim that, and it does not imply guilt.
Right.
But, you know, I think the committee has a right to ask him to come before the committee and testify, and he has the right to claim the Fifth Amendment. So we'll see what happens from there.
People talk one way when it's not themselves who are in jeopardy. We've seen that before.
Yes.
On the intel side, what are you hearing from Republican colleagues who are publicly quiet about what the president did in divulging classified information to the Russians, calling Comey a nut job and saying that firing him got the pressure off him? We just had Senator Langford on. He said, you know, in public, he's given the president somewhat of a pass. In private, he'll talk to him. What are you hearing about the GOP who aren't speaking out?
Well, I think what I'm hearing from not a lot of Republicans, but when they comment, that they're very concerned. They're concerned about what the president is doing, the actions that he's taken. Yes, disclosure of information to the Russians, and Now I just saw, I think this morning, and maybe it was last night, that Duarte was on the phone with President Trump, and he disclosed the whereabouts of a couple of nuclear submarines, which is obviously highly classified information, which should not be divulged to anybody, particularly for the safety of those men and women of the Navy who are on those ships, but also the fact that that information may be transmitted to others who are not our friends. So that I think this administration, again, has been very sloppy in terms of following procedures which would protect our national security, the President in particular. And I think it's of great concern to the members of Congress that I talk to, including some of my Republican friends who privately, as you point out, Chris, are expressing great reservations about what this President is doing.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic we see unfolding. You have all these leaks coming out, often from officials, the White House, the intel community, because they're concerned about the president's actions. It's creating an interesting dynamic for the American people. Congressman, thank you for joining us. You're always welcome on New Day to talk about what matters.